Hello everyone, my name is Mark Jarvis and I'm a visiting professor at Manchester Metropolitan University's Business School in the Accounting, Finance and Banking department. So welcome to our August webinar. We are in the holiday season now. We're doing this once a month and we'll be back to a more robust frequency after the holiday season. I hope you're all enjoying the heat and the thunder and the lightning, which is where we are at the moment. So we always start these webinars with a quick look at, of course, the pandemic that's going on at the moment. And I think it would be remiss of me not to have a look at the statistics with you. That I know you've all seen these on TV every night. But it's sometimes useful just to have a quick look and a quick overview. So if I may, I'll share this screen with you. So on the left-hand side here, we have the cumulative number of cases since a data point of 10,000. It's quite obvious here that the United States is on a very difficult trajectory. And I think Brazil is a concern, but India here, as you can see, is really almost moving into a vertical growth period. So although us in the UK, we have regional lockdowns, which of course are particularly worrying, we are at this space down here very flat and relatively small. Now, of course, the table on the right here looks at it differently, and it looks at how the cases are per million of population, which I think is fairer on the big countries, because otherwise it's very easy to distort these figures. But unfortunately, the USA here still tops out at 8 on the list of cases per million of population. And Brazil coming in at 12 down here. Interestingly, the UK is now 50th on this list of total cases per 1 million population. So still a long way to go, perhaps, and rumours of the second wave and other frightening statistics we have to keep an eye on. But of course, front of mind is the GDP and where our economy is taking us. So I think, if I may, I'll share a few slides here, just the impact of the coronavirus on the pandemic global economy. And I'll start with the global, and then I'll delve a little bit more into the UK. But here is a slide put together by the International Monetary Fund. It's a World Economic Outlook. It's pretty recent, it's June, and growth projections. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, there are 2019, 2021. We're looking here at a mixed bag from 2.9 in 2019, which was not great growth, of course, down to minus 4.95%, but then a kick up in 21, 5.4. I think interesting to note the difference between the advanced economies, developed markets, and the emerging and developing economies. And so we do expect, I think, to see a greater fall in GDP in the developed economies, with a little less in the emerging market, but certainly a pickup in 2021. When that will get back to 2019 levels is obviously a very difficult question to answer. But taking together, you know, the estimates are quite drastic, but materially less sharp than was the case in the May illustrative scenario. This is largely because social distancing measures have been eased quite earlier than a lot of us thought in a number of countries. It also appears that consumer spending has begun to recover across a number of countries, even before the official lockdown measures were eased. And I think this is obviously the online factor kicking in here. So I think we generally believe that absent of a widespread resurgence of lockdown measures, output is expected to recover somewhat in Q3. All major regions are expected to record positive growth as activities continue to recover. But nonetheless, the world GDP is probably not going to get back to its 2019 level for some time. And if I may show you one more slide here, I know it's not the prettiest slide, and I apologize for that. I snapped it just recently before this call. It's the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, August 20 data. And here we are looking across the world at the world GDP, the average over that 10-year period, the average over that 8-year period, 2019, which was a very slow year for the world, and then boom, -6 a bit. 2021 picks up, but very much, you know, we've talked on these calls about a V or a U-shape return. It's clearly not a V shape, it's more of a U shape. And back to some semblance of normality in 2022. But the UK GDP here is really struggling with the -9.5 down here. A pickup in 2021 and moving forward, therefore. So let's turn now to the UK economy. I mean, this slide really puts it into perspective about how difficult our situation is. A -20.4% return in Q2 2020, which, well, the graph says it all, really. I think there's nothing more I can say. The UK economy really shrank by this excruciating 20.4% in the second quarter. This was the height of its coronavirus outbreak, of course. So quarter on quarter GDP growth figures for Q1 already showed a fall of 2.2%. And of course, with double quarter negative GDP growth, we are now in a technical recession. So even before the corona pandemic, the UK had recorded quite a weak quarter in Q4 2019 when GDP was stagnated at 0%, if you recall back then. It seems like a different world now. But as you can see from this slide, the Q2 represents a phenomenal fall, and it just pales into significance the financial crisis back in 08-09. And so the question is, what next? One of the issues for the UK is the economy is more service orientated. Some 70% of the workforce are related to services and therefore depends on face-to-face interaction. However, some better news was that last Thursday, the Bank of England cut its unemployment forecast to 9%. That was down from its earlier forecast, and it would be below the 12% we saw after the severe economic recession in the 1980s. So nevertheless, while we're seeing redundancies in those industries worst affected by the COVID-19, such as retail, airlines, tourism, hospitality, the crunch point will come this autumn when the furlough scheme ends. And that will, unfortunately, really begin to open the floodgates. Consensus Economics, which compiles all the major forecasts of city institutions, said that the average estimate for GDP to fall by 9.2% across 2020 and to recover by 5.9% in 2021. The EY Item Club, which uses the Treasury's computer model of the economy, takes a gloomier view. Some are forecast downgraded previous prediction of -8% to 11.5%, so quite staggering figures. The Bank of England, however, now expects the economy to slump 9.5% in 2020, which is significantly better, if I can use that word, to its estimate back in earlier this year, when it was looking at a 13 to 14%. But of course, a lot of unknown factors, that's the reality. And I think this graph, again, from the Bank of England, just shows that there is a huge unsurety. The darker colors, of course, is the more sure space on GDP growth, and here unemployment. But there is a range of factors, and if you're on the outlying of these factors, we could be into a very different situation. So we'll really have to keep an eye on that and see what happens after the furlough. I think that is the key next step, pending a wave 2 in the UK. The next big event is really the unleashing of the furlough. I would also just, for a moment talk about, as you probably realize, I do love my graphs, but here is an interesting unemployment statistic. And as you can see right now, the unemployment, 3.94% of the population, of the employment population. So nothing really happened at the moment. And again, this is due to Rishi Sunak's strategy of furloughing the at-risk employees and hoping for the buffer that they can pick up again. Now, if you contrast that to the US, where we haven't had such a policy, this is the spike you see when the reality of the unemployment consequences kicks in. And that really is a very, very different figure. So again, lots to think about and a lot to wait to see what really happens. But nevertheless, the Bank of England has, and forgive me for sharing a lot of the Bank of England stuff, but I do think it's particularly useful because it's fresh and it's new. Here we have their view. You can see the GDP growth, the down, which we just talked about, and the up again throughout 2020. But if one important thing here, look at that line compared to going back in time. That's a long time for us to get back up to where we were even in 2019. The unemployment rate here, the projection bit, adds on those furlough exiters, which could be turned into unemployed people. Inflation seems under control, so I think we're more relaxed about inflation. So, but don't forget, all of this economy, this I wouldn't say growth, of course, but this neutrality in the economy is funded by debt. And according to a letter from major economists sent to the Treasury this week, small and mid-sized companies that do not have easy access to the public equity markets and under most pressure, they employ some 16 million people in total, and a combined turnover of £2 trillion in the UK. And of course, they've taken on debt using the government's coronavirus bailout schemes. The group said a professional analyst found unsustainable debt held by UK private companies could reach between 90 and 105 billion by March 2020. So the government's two loan schemes aimed at small and medium-sized businesses have state guarantees up to 80% and could account for between 10 and 20 billion of this. But businesses have borrowed more than 50 billion through government-backed loans since March. The Treasury figures suggest that 1.2 million businesses have drawn on this support. And at the same time, the cost of the coronavirus job retention scheme rose from 31.7 billion to 33.8 billion. The program, which, as we said before, will close in October, has been paying most of the wages of about 10 million workers. So the figures will fuel concerns that companies are taking on too much debt. Economists have said that many businesses will struggle to repay their debts if the economy does not recover quickly. And whilst GDP is projected to recover, we need that recovery to be assured and going forward. So moving forward, there's always an interesting, we've done this before, and I'll just share this slide with you. Apple tracks of people. We all know that. We all know our phones are monitored. This is a graph of Apple mobility indices, and this shows how people have been restricted or unleashed in the lockdown measures. And I do think that we're seeing a lot of concerns in the European area about the rise of a second wave, and you can see here the mobility is just growing and growing and growing. The UK, everybody's growing, of course, but even the US is beginning to flatten out on its mobility. The UK is beginning to flatten out as we begin to tackle some lockdowns here. But some concerns there about the European area and the way perhaps they are looking at too early freedom of movement. I know it's a terrible thing to say. I can't believe actually I'm saying restrictions of freedom of movement, but that's the new world we're in, right? So now there are some other consequences from COVID-19. These are the big ones we've just talked about: GDP, debt, unemployment. But behind the scenes, COVID's not only had a devastating health consequences since March 2020, but we've seen economic repercussions of the pandemic placing unprecedented pressure on the world of work. But recent research suggests that in the UK, this pressure is not being distributed equally across the workforce. To date, women have suffered a larger fall in earnings and are losing their jobs in greater numbers than men during the COVID-19 pandemic, indicating that the progress in closing gender pay gaps may be slowed or even reversed at a time when some progress has been made and it is needed most. There are many reasons for this imbalance. Obviously, women are more likely than men to work in social sectors, which have been some of the hardest hits by social distancing measures. Having had to either completely stop operations or significantly alter their practices and largely unable to offer remote working opportunities to employers, these sectors have seen large numbers of employees either placed on furlough or let go. So on top of this, since the lockdown measures were put in place and school closures announced, it's also been reported that women in the UK are bearing the brunt of additional childcare and housework. The expectation of care provision is the single most significant barrier to women's economic participation globally. Already accounting for 3/4 of the part-time labour force, women were hit when part-time jobs saw a 70% decrease in the first 3 months of the pandemic. As schools, daycare centres and elderly care options shut down to stem the spread of the virus, women across industries saw the support they required to maintain employment removed. So with working women in Europe and North America contributing between 35 and 45% of their country's GDP, it's vital that these realities for women's economic position and the new working requirements are considered as we plan for this economic recovery. Looking ahead, companies should not plan to just go back to the old processes, the old ways of working that were the status quo before the pandemic, but should use this opportunity to review and modernize working standards. Many employees continue to take on additional care responsibilities. Workplace flexibility will remain crucial. So managers should acknowledge that shift patterns may need to be reassessed so that companies can get the most out of their employees while being sensitive to non-work obligations. That when attracting new employees, the changing preferences of candidates in light of the pandemic should also carefully be considered to ensure a diverse talent pool. With more women than men now pursuing higher education in the UK, it's critical that businesses carefully consider recruitment strategies and employ benefits that will attract women to join their workforce going forward. That when you're redesigning your office, when you're thinking about workplace for the future in a post-pandemic situation, think about a creche. Think about what that can do to the whole family. What is good for women is good for economic growth and resilience. Not only will creating more inclusive workplace requirements assist women's economic empowerment, but it will also support an inclusive and successful post-COVID-19 strategy. Turning quickly to the US, amid the rising deaths, infections, and possible economic implosion, the country's most pressing need to save lives and arrest any plunge in a prolonged recession or depression even. That the crisis is already hitting major social and economic systems. But Black Americans will experience a disproportionate share of the disruption, from morbidity and mortality to unemployment and bankruptcy. McKinsey has analysed this, and it shows that Black Americans are almost twice as likely to live in the areas of the US at higher risk of health and economic disruption, if or when the pandemic hits those particular counties. So to assess this disruption, McKinsey evaluated 5 indicators: underlying health conditions, poverty rate, number of hospital beds, percentage of people in severe housing, and population density. Excuse me. This integrated health and economic perspective describes which counties are likely to take a bigger punch due to the pandemic and could get trapped in this vicious cycle of economic instability and poor health. In addition, McKinsey found that 39% of all jobs held by Black Americans, compared with 34% held by white Americans, are now threatened in a reduction of hours or temporary. And if I just may share a slide with you, forgive me for interrupting. So they are threatened by reduction of hours, pay, temporary furloughs, permanent layoffs, totaling 7 million jobs. So this is this graph, I almost don't need to say anything, but the difference here, my job has been negatively impacted, and here my income has been negatively impacted, along with the persistent gap, which I know, I'm sorry, this only goes up to 2016, but you get the impression here, and certainly recessions tend to widen that rather than close it. So I think the pandemic underscores the consequences of this structural disparities that have persisted in the US and elsewhere, of course, for centuries. And again, it presents an opportunity to invest in building a more equitable system that will really benefit society overall. And again, there are other consequences. I think probably what I've said today, most of you will be aware of it in some shape or form, but there are other consequences that are not so obvious. Such as something called global remittances. And many parts of the world, across let's say Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, the Philippines, they have their indigenous people go overseas and work and send money back. That's called global remittances. So money sent by migrants back to their home countries has taken a steep decline in 2020 and is expected to decrease. So according to data published by the World Bank, global remittances are projected to fall by a record 20% this year. Some of the largest declines will be felt in areas of Europe, Central Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. The projected decline in remittance back to the home countries is much larger than was felt during the recession in 2009, where we just saw a 15% decline compared to today, a projected 28% decline. Sub-Saharan Africa is projected to see a 23% decline compared to in 2009, a net zero decline. Overall, the top remittance sending countries like the US, Saudi Arabia, and UAE have all experienced some of the harshest COVID-19 restrictions during the pandemic. And this has greatly contributed to the projected fall in remittances and countries dependent on these payments. So, like countries as the Palestine territory, Haiti, Nepal, all of these countries could feel a very, very quick consequence of the restrictions and decline on money sent home. And perhaps if I can share with you one last slide, you see the magnitude of this across some of the big countries. The World Bank has said that the Asian countries are the biggest remittance receivers after India, China, Mexico, the Philippines, huge amounts of money, 33.8 billion in remittances, which is 10% of their GDP on average. Pakistan and Bangladesh, 7% of GDP, and Nepal, believe it or not, 27% of their GDP. So as these Asian remittance senders have lost out on their wages in the countries around the world, the Middle East, the United States, Europe, we will see a consequent hidden impact to the GDP of these countries, which is not only due to the lockdown and the loss of business locally, but the loss of the remittance impact, which drives anything from 10 to 25% of GDP. So I'm sorry, this is probably not the happiest webinar I've done. I think we are still in a very difficult place and a lot to go, both in the UK as we unlock the furlough scheme, around the world as we see the consequences such as the global remittances. So perhaps many of the consequences are still hidden and lurking in the dark. But I hope you found this useful. Again, I'm Mark Jarvis, and thank you for watching and listening.